After my husband died, his mother said, "I will take everything. You are a stranger in this family." I silently nodded. But she had no idea that a week before his death, my husband had secretly transferred everything into my name. When the notary read the will, she grabbed the chair. "Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to believe that love was enough to make a family accept you. I know better now. My name is Megan Cole. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, the kind of city where front porches still mean something, where neighbors bring casseroles when life falls apart. I was 32 when I married Daniel Cole, and I was the happiest I'd ever been. Daniel was an architect, quiet, steady, the kind of man who remembered which coffee mug was your favorite and never used it himself. We met at a firm downtown where I worked as a project coordinator. He asked me to lunch 3 times before I said yes. I made him work for it, and he never once complained about that. We bought a house in a suburb north of Atlanta. 4 bedrooms, a backyard with an oak tree old enough to have a history. We talked about children the way young couples do, in the soft, hypothetical language of people who believe they have all the time in the world. We had been married for 4 years when Daniel was diagnosed with an aggressive form of pancreatic cancer. He was 38 years old. I won't linger on those months because even now the memory of them sits in my chest like something that never fully dissolved. What I will say is this: Daniel fought. He went to every appointment, tried every treatment his oncologist suggested, and he never once stopped being the man I married. Steady, quiet, present. What I also remember is that during those months, I first began to notice Beverly. Beverly Cole was Daniel's mother. She was 61 years old, a retired bank manager from Marietta, who wore her silver hair like armor and her opinions like a second skin. I had always known she didn't fully approve of me. It was nothing she ever said directly. Beverly was too controlled for directness. It was the way she scanned my kitchen when she visited, the pause before she complimented my cooking, the way she addressed Daniel as though I were simply a pleasant piece of furniture in the room. Her daughter Diane, Daniel's younger sister, was her instrument. Diane repeated Beverly's thoughts with less polish and more noise. Before Daniel got sick, I managed their dynamic by keeping a certain pleasant distance. We had holidays together. We exchanged birthday cards. I smiled at family dinners and told myself that not every mother-in-law is meant to be your friend. It was a sustainable arrangement. Cancer broke the arrangement. The moment Daniel's diagnosis became serious, Beverly began arriving at our house without calling ahead. She would let herself in with the spare key Daniel had given her years before, a key I had never formally asked her to return because it seemed unkind to ask while her son was dying. She would rearrange things in my kitchen. She would speak to Daniel's doctors at appointments as though I were a guest in my own marriage. Once she told Daniel's oncologist that she was the primary family contact, while I was standing 3 feet away holding Daniel's IV schedule on a printed sheet of paper. I said nothing. Daniel squeezed my hand afterward in the car. He knew. We didn't need to say it out loud. But it was one evening in November, 2 weeks before Daniel died, that Beverly said the thing that changed everything. Daniel had fallen asleep early, exhausted from a morning treatment. Beverly and I were in the kitchen. Diane was there too, sitting at my table as though it were hers, scrolling through her phone. The house was quiet in that way that only happens when someone is very sick inside it. Beverly turned from the counter and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as deliberately calm. She said, I want you to know that when the time comes, I intend to make sure this family is protected. Daniel's assets, this house, everything he built, it belongs to the Coles. You've been a fine wife, Megan, but you're not a Cole by blood, and this family takes care of its own." Diane did not look up from her phone. She didn't have to. She had heard this before. I stood in my own kitchen, in the house Daniel and I had chosen together, and I felt something cold move through me. Not grief, not anger, something quieter than both. I nodded once. I said nothing. Beverly seemed satisfied by my silence. She mistook it for acceptance. She had no way of knowing that 7 days before he died, Daniel had sat with a private attorney in this very house and signed documents that rewrote every assumption Beverly had spent months building. She had no way of knowing what was already done. But that night, I didn't know it either. That night, I only knew that I was alone in a way I hadn't been prepared for, and that the woman standing in my kitchen was already measuring the walls. Daniel died on a Tuesday morning just before dawn. The hospice nurse was there. I was holding his hand. Beverly arrived 40 minutes later, before I'd even made a phone call, which told me she'd been waiting nearby. She walked past me in the doorway without touching me and went straight to Daniel's bedside. I stood in the hallway of my own home and let her have that moment because he was her son, and some griefs are not negotiable. The funeral was 4 days later. I arranged everything, the chapel, the flowers, the reception at our house afterward. I called Daniel's colleagues, his old friends from college, his cousin Marcus in Charlotte, who drove 8 hours to be there. Beverly stood at the reception in my living room accepting condolences as though she were the widow. Diane circulated through the guests with a practiced sadness that I recognized as performance. I moved through the afternoon on the specific kind of autopilot that only profound exhaustion produces. It was at the reception, while I was standing near the kitchen doorway with a cup of tea I hadn't drunk, that Beverly approached me. The house was full of people. She stood close enough that only I could hear her. Her voice was pleasant, almost gentle, in the way that a verdict read aloud in a quiet courtroom can sound almost gentle. "We should sit down soon and talk about practical matters," she said. "The house, his accounts, the investments. I've already been in touch with a family attorney. I want this handled correctly." I looked at her. "Daniel had a will," I said. "Wills can be contested," Beverly replied, and smiled the way people smile when they want you to understand that the smile is the threat, especially when there are questions about the circumstances under which they were signed. Then she turned and went to refresh her drink. I set my tea down on the counter and stood very still. Around me, people were talking about Daniel. His laugh, a fishing trip someone remembered, the way he always brought homemade bread to office potlucks. The world was continuing its ordinary motion, and I was standing in the center of my kitchen calculating what I was actually facing. The fear came that night, real fear. Not the ambient dread of the preceding months, but specific, cold, and practical. I sat at the kitchen table after everyone had gone, and I made myself think clearly. Beverly had resources. She had a family attorney she'd already contacted. She had Diane, who would say whatever Beverly needed her to say. She had the narrative of the grieving mother, which in a Southern courtroom, or in the court of family opinion, which can be its own kind of jurisdiction, carries enormous weight, and she had already told me plainly that she intended to contest. What did I have? I had 4 years of marriage. I had joint accounts, a mortgage in both our names, and the memory of a husband who had loved me without apology. I also had, somewhere in the back of my mind, a detail I hadn't fully processed yet. 2 weeks before he died, Daniel had asked me to step out of the room while he spoke privately with a man I didn't recognize. He'd introduced the man as a colleague, but colleagues don't come to dying men's homes with leather briefcases on a Sunday afternoon. I hadn't asked Daniel about it afterward. He'd seemed tired, and I hadn't wanted to add weight to the little time we had left. But now, sitting alone in the kitchen at midnight, I began to think about that Sunday afternoon differently. I needed information before I needed a plan. The next morning, the day after Daniel's funeral, I called my friend Claire. Claire was a paralegal who had worked in estate law for 11 years. She was the kind of person who answered practical questions without dramatizing them, which was exactly what I needed. I told her what Beverly had said at the reception. I told her about the man with the briefcase. There was a pause on the line. "Megan," Claire said carefully, "did Daniel ever mention making any changes to his estate documents?" "No," I said, "but I think he might have." "Then your first step," she said, "is to find out exactly what documents exist and who prepared them. Before Beverly's attorney makes any moves, you need to know what you're standing on." That was my plan. Simple, procedural, and necessary. I would find out what Daniel had done. I would find out before Beverly did. And I would do it quietly, because the moment Beverly knew I was looking, she would begin to move faster than I could. I spent the rest of that day making a list. The name of Daniel's regular attorney, a firm in Buckhead he'd used for standard documents. The name of the man with the briefcase, which I found in Daniel's desk drawer on a business card. Robert Tanner, Estate Planning and Private Counsel, Roswell, Georgia. A phone number, a small gold logo. I held the card in my hand for a long moment. Why would Daniel go outside his regular attorney for estate planning? There was only one answer that made sense, and it settled into me quietly, like something that had been waiting to be understood. He hadn't wanted anyone in the family to know. I called Robert Tanner's office the following morning. His receptionist was polite and efficient, and when I gave her my name, there was a brief pause. Not the pause of confusion, but the pause of recognition. "Mrs. Cole," she said, "Mr. Tanner has been expecting your call. Can you come in Thursday at 2? That pause told me everything I needed to know going in. I drove to Roswell on Thursday in the rain. Tanner's office was in a converted Victorian house on a quiet street lined with old magnolias. The waiting room smelled like wood smoke and old paper, the particular combination of a space that takes its business seriously. Robert Tanner himself was in his mid-50s, methodical in the way that good attorneys always are, with the kind of careful diction that comes from spending decades choosing every word with precision. He shook my hand, offered coffee, and then opened a file on his desk. "Mrs. Cole," he said, "your husband retained my services 6 weeks before his passing. He was very specific about what he wanted and very specific about the timeline. He asked me not to contact you directly until after his death, unless you reached out first. He said, and I'm quoting him from my notes, that he didn't want the last weeks to feel like paperwork." I didn't say anything. I pressed my hands flat on my knees under the desk and waited. Tanner continued. Daniel had executed a new will, signed and witnessed with full legal formality, 7 days before he died. He had also updated the beneficiary designations on his 2 life insurance policies, his 401k, and a brokerage account that Beverly almost certainly didn't know existed. Daniel had opened it quietly 3 years earlier as a long-term investment, separate from our joint finances. The house, already jointly owned, would pass to me by operation of law. The new will named me as the sole beneficiary of his estate, explicitly superseding any prior documents, and included a clause acknowledging that the change had been made of Daniel's own free will, with full mental capacity, without coercion. There was also a letter. Tanner slid it across the desk in a sealed envelope with my name on it in Daniel's handwriting. I didn't open it in the office. I thanked Tanner, scheduled a follow-up appointment to begin formal probate proceedings, and drove to a park 2 blocks away. I sat in my car with the rain on the windshield and opened the envelope. I will keep the contents of that letter private, because some things belong only to the people they were written for. What I will say is that Daniel had understood, with the clear-eyed clarity that sometimes comes to people who know they are dying, exactly what Beverly intended to do. He had watched her for months, the same way I had. He had seen the architecture of her plan before she fully built it, and he had quietly, methodically made sure she couldn't carry it out. He had protected me. I sat in that car for 20 minutes. Then I drove home. Beverly called that evening. Her voice had the calibrated warmth she deployed when she wanted something. She asked how I was doing, said she'd been thinking about me, mentioned that her attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, had suggested we meet soon to discuss Daniel's affairs together as a family. She said the word family 3 times in 2 minutes. I counted. Of course, I said, I'll be in touch. I hung up and called Claire. She's moving, I told her. Then you need to file, Claire said. Get Tanner to open probate this week. Once the will is entered into court records, it's public. She can still contest it, but it becomes significantly harder and significantly more expensive. You want to be standing on ground she has to fight for, not ground she just walks onto. I called Tanner first thing Friday morning. We filed to open probate that afternoon. What I didn't know was that Diane had been watching my car. Beverly's house was 20 minutes from mine, and Diane had driven past my street twice that week. I found this out later. She had seen me leave on Thursday in the rain, dressed in something other than grief clothes, carrying a folder. She had reported back to Beverly. Beverly's attorney, Gerald Foss, made 3 calls on Friday afternoon, 1 to the probate court, 1 to Daniel's regular firm in Buckhead, and 1 to a private investigator whose name I would learn later. The moment I filed, they knew I had something. They just didn't know what. And that window, between what they suspected and what they could prove, was the only advantage I had. Probate court in Georgia moves slowly, which I had been warned about. What I hadn't been warned about was how quickly Beverly moved the moment she learned the will had been filed. I found out what the will contained, as did she, through the public court record, exactly as Claire had predicted. The difference was that I already knew. Beverly found out on a Monday morning when her attorney pulled the filing. Tanner called me at 10 to let me know it was now a matter of record. By noon, Beverly had called my phone 4 times without leaving a message. By 2 o'clock, Diane had left a voicemail that began with, "I don't know what you think you're doing," and declined from there. I listened to Diane's message once, saved it, and did not call back. The formal letter came 3 days later on Beverly's attorney's letterhead. Gerald Foss was a competent, aggressive family attorney who had clearly been briefed to lead with intimidation. The letter stated that Beverly Cole intended to contest the will on the grounds of undue influence, the allegation being that I had manipulated a critically ill man into changing his estate documents in my favor. The letter also raised obliquely the question of Daniel's mental capacity in his final weeks, suggesting that the medication he'd been prescribed could have affected his judgment. I read that letter 3 times. The accusation that I had manipulated Daniel, who had arranged every detail of that meeting with Tanner on his own, who had written me a letter in his own clear hand, was the kind of thing that sits differently from ordinary insults. It wasn't just wrong. It was a specific, strategic wrongness designed to reframe Daniel's own final act of love as my manipulation. I drove to Tanner's office that afternoon and laid the letter on his desk. He read it without expression. "This is standard contested will strategy," he said. "They're going to argue capacity and undue influence because those are the 2 available levers. The good news is that Daniel anticipated this." He opened the file and showed me what Daniel had arranged. A written evaluation from his oncologist, dated the same week as the will signing, confirming his cognitive clarity. A separate sworn statement from the 2 witnesses to the signing. A neighbor and a former colleague of Daniel's, neither of whom had any relationship with me. And Tanner's own detailed contemporaneous notes documenting Daniel's demeanor, his articulate instructions, and the fact that I had not been present at any point during the signing process. "He built this to withstand a challenge," Tanner said. That was the moment I understood the full depth of what Daniel had done. He hadn't just left me his estate. He had left me a legal architecture designed to protect it. But Beverly wasn't finished. 2 weeks after the attorney's letter, Beverly and Diane showed up at my house. It was a Saturday morning. I watched their car pull into my driveway from the kitchen window, and I felt the particular stillness that comes when you've been expecting something and it finally arrives. I opened the door before they knocked. Beverly stood on my porch in a dark coat, her expression set in the arrangement she used when she believed she was being magnanimous. "Megan," she said, "we need to talk. Can we come in?" I let them in. We sat in the living room, the same room where Daniel's reception had been held, where people had told stories about him while Beverly stood accepting condolences. I did not offer coffee. Beverly spoke with controlled precision. She told me that this legal process was going to be long, expensive, and painful for everyone. She told me that contesting the will was the family's right, and she said right the way people say it when they mean power. Then she told me that if I agreed to a settlement, surrendering the house and Daniel's investment accounts, retaining only the life insurance payout, the contest would be dropped and things could end civilly. "Think about your life here, Megan," she said. "You're 35 years old. You have no children, no roots in this city that aren't through Daniel. Why spend the next 2 years in a courtroom? Take what's fair and start over." Diane said nothing. She watched me with her mother's eyes. I looked at Beverly for a long moment. "I'll have my attorney respond," I said. Beverly's composure slipped, just briefly. Just at the edges. She had expected tears, or yielding, or at minimum a longer conversation she could work on. She had not expected 3 flat words and a closed face. "Megan?" "I'll see you out," I said. They left. I closed the door and stood in the hallway with my back against it, listening to their car reverse out of the driveway. My hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear exactly, but from the effort of the preceding 15 minutes. I called Tanner and reported the conversation. He told me to document it in writing immediately, which I did. Then I booked 4 nights at a small inn in the North Georgia mountains that Daniel and I had visited twice before. I told no one where I was going except Claire. I packed a bag, drove north, and spent 4 days walking trails and sitting by a fire and doing nothing that resembled strategy. I needed to return to myself before I could finish this. I came back from the mountains on a Wednesday. The house felt different when I unlocked the door. Or perhaps I was different. 4 days of silence and cold air had clarified something in me that the preceding weeks of legal paperwork and grief and hostility had been slowly obscuring. I had been reacting. From this point forward, I intended to move by my own design. Beverly's first attempt at a different approach came 9 days after the living room confrontation. Not a visit this time, a phone call, and not from Beverly herself, but from Daniel's uncle Raymond. Raymond Cole was 70 years old, a retired contractor from Augusta who had been, in my experience, a perfectly decent man with no appetite for conflict. His call was uncomfortable for him. I could hear it in his voice. But Beverly had sent him nonetheless. "Megan," he said after the preliminary condolences, "I know things are difficult right now. Beverly asked me to reach out. She's suggesting that if you're open to a conversation without the attorneys involved, she thinks there might be a way through this that doesn't hurt everyone." I recognized the tactic immediately. Send the neutral relative. Establish a softer emotional register. Propose a meeting without lawyers. Which would, of course, benefit only the side that was less legally protected. "Raymond," I said, "I appreciate you calling. I genuinely do. But any communication about Daniel's estate needs to go through Mr. Tanner. That's not about hostility. It's about doing things correctly." There was a long pause. "I understand," he said. And then quietly, almost to himself, "She's not going to let this go easily." "I know," I said. We ended the call with mutual politeness, and I don't think Raymond called again after that. Beverly's second attempt was more calculated. 3 days later, I received an email to my personal address, which Beverly had obtained from somewhere in the family network, containing a scanned article about contested estate litigation in Georgia. No message, just the article, forwarded with Beverly's email address in the sender field. The article described a case in which a surviving spouse had faced a 2-year legal battle and significant legal fees before eventually prevailing. The implication was obvious. Look at how long and expensive this will be. Is it worth it? I printed the email, added it to the documentation file I had been building since the first attorney's letter, and forwarded it to Tanner. "She's trying to wear you down psychologically," he said. "I know," I said. "It's not working." And it wasn't. But I want to be honest about what that required. Equanimity in the face of sustained pressure is not a natural state. It is a discipline, and it is one I had to practice deliberately. Every morning I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and spent 20 minutes being still before I opened my email or my phone. I read nothing about the case before noon. I cooked actual meals instead of eating standing over the sink. These were small practices, but they were the difference between a person who is managing and a person who is barely holding. What helped most, though, was the people I had around me. Claire was the practical anchor. She explained every legal development in plain language, caught the emotional content I was too close to see, and never once told me the situation was simpler than it was. My friend Joanna, who had known me since college, drove down from Nashville for a long weekend in December. She did not treat me as a grieving widow or as a woman in a legal battle. She treated me as Megan, which was exactly what I needed. We went to a wine bar. We talked about things that had nothing to do with Beverly Cole, and I laughed for the first time in 2 months. There was also Marcus, Daniel's cousin, the one who had driven from Charlotte for the funeral. Marcus called me on a Tuesday evening in December, not at Beverly's behest, but entirely on his own. "I want you to know," he said, "that not everyone in this family thinks what Beverly is doing is right. Daniel loved you. Anyone who spent 5 minutes with you two could see it. I'm sorry you're having to deal with this." I almost cried. I held it together through the phone call and cried quietly afterward, sitting at the bottom of the stairs in the hallway. Not from sadness exactly, from the specific relief of being seen by someone who had known Daniel, being affirmed in a reality that Beverly and Diane had been working week by week to dismantle. I had a legal architect named Tanner. I had a practical friend named Claire. I had Joanna and Marcus. That was the team I was going to finish this with. Beverly, watching from whatever distance she kept, saw that I was not wilting. I later learned from Marcus that this frustrated her. She had assumed isolation would follow grief, that without Daniel I would be unmoored and manageable. She had miscalculated the kind of person I was. She and Diane began making other preparations. It was a Saturday in January, 4 months after Daniel's death, when Beverly arrived at my door again. This time she came alone. No Diane. No attorney's letter preceding the visit. She stood on my porch with a ceramic dish covered in foil, a casserole, as though we were neighbors experiencing a mild inconvenience rather than adversaries in a probate dispute. And she was smiling the way women smile when they want you to believe the war is over. I let her in because refusing entry accomplishes nothing except providing a grievance narrative, and I had been counseled by Tanner to keep all interactions documented and controlled rather than hostile. We sat at the kitchen table. She had brought, she said, a chicken casserole. She set it on the counter. She accepted the glass of water I offered, and then she began. She started with grief, specifically her own. She talked about Daniel as a child, about the particular loneliness of outliving your son, about the sleepless nights and the empty Sundays. Some of it, I believed, was genuine. Beverly Cole was not a woman without real emotion. She was a woman who deployed real emotion strategically, and the combination makes something more dangerous than simple cynicism. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she said after a while, "about the way things have been between us. I don't want to spend whatever time I have left fighting with my son's widow." She paused. I said nothing. "I want to make a real offer, Megan, not through attorneys, from me to you at this table." She folded her hands. "I'm willing to ask Gerald to withdraw the contest, completely, no conditions, if we can agree on one thing." I waited. The house, she said. Just the house. Everything else, the accounts, the insurance, all of it. It's yours. But the house was in the Cole family for years before Daniel bought it. It has meaning for us. I want to know it stays in the family. She looked at me with the expression of a woman making a painful concession. I looked back at her. The house had not been in the Cole family before Daniel bought it. Daniel had found it through a real estate listing, had negotiated the purchase himself, and had put it in both our names as a marital home. Beverly had visited it perhaps a dozen times in 4 years. The Cole family meaning she was invoking did not exist. More importantly, the will left me the entire estate. Accepting this offer would mean voluntarily surrendering the single largest asset Daniel had left me in exchange for dropping a will contest that Tanner had told me, privately, candidly, had a low probability of success. Beverly was asking me to trade a real asset for the removal of a threat that had limited practical power. Beverly, I said, I know what this offer is. Her expression didn't change. You're asking me to give up the house in exchange for dropping a contest that your own attorney has probably told you is difficult to win. You're not conceding anything. You're hoping I don't know the strength of my own position. The warmth in Beverly's face went out like a light switched off. What replaced it was something I had only seen briefly before. In the kitchen, the night she'd told me I was not a Cole by blood. The controlled, certain coldness of a woman who has decided that obstacles are to be removed. You're making a mistake, she said quietly. A serious one. I have resources you don't have. I have history in this city, connections that go back 30 years. I can make this process painful in ways that have nothing to do with the law. Socially, professionally. People listen to me. There it was, behind the casserole and the folded hands and the talk of loneliness. There it was. I'm sure they do, I said. I'd like you to leave now. She stood. For a moment she stood looking at me as though calculating whether there was another angle she hadn't tried. Then she picked up her purse and walked to the door. At the threshold she turned. You have no idea what this family is capable of, Megan. I'm starting to, I said. She left. The door closed. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, and I will admit this. I was afraid. Beverly's threat about social and professional influence was not empty air. She was a 61-year-old woman from Marietta with genuine connections and genuine resources and a genuine willingness to use them. What she had just outlined, a campaign of social pressure and reputational damage, was real, but the fear did something I hadn't expected. It didn't paralyze me. It clarified me. Fear, when you are already decided, becomes a kind of fuel. I took Beverly's casserole and put it in the refrigerator. Then I sat down and wrote a detailed contemporaneous account of the entire conversation, including the specific threat she had made. I emailed it to Tanner with a subject line that read, Documentation. Verbal threat, January 18th. He responded within 2 hours. This is useful. Keep going. I intended to. The probate hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in late February. Beverly's attorney had filed the formal contest 3 weeks earlier as expected. Undue influence and capacity, exactly the 2 levers Tanner had predicted. Gerald Foss had submitted affidavits from 2 of Beverly's friends, both of whom claimed to have observed me behaving in a controlling manner toward Daniel during his illness. One affidavit described me intercepting communications between Daniel and Beverly. The other claimed I had discouraged Daniel from seeing family in his final weeks. I read these affidavits carefully. Both were plausible-sounding, vague constructions of events that had not occurred, designed to create an emotional picture rather than establish legal facts. Beverly's friends had not spent meaningful time at our house during Daniel's illness. They were producing narratives that Beverly had provided them. Tanner was unmoved. "The standard of proof for undue influence is high," he said. "They need to show that your influence was so overwhelming it substituted your judgment for his. Given what Daniel prepared, that's going to be very difficult for them to establish." The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully, not formally, not in a way that would read as performance, simply well. I drove to the courthouse with Tanner, arrived early, and sat outside the hearing room with a cup of coffee I barely touched. Beverly and Diane arrived 10 minutes later. Beverly was in a dark suit. She looked at me once, briefly, and then looked away. Diane did not look at me at all. Gerald Foss, Beverly's attorney, was a broad-shouldered man in his 60s who had the particular confidence of someone who had won more hearings than he'd lost. He shook Tanner's hand with the professionalism of opponents who know each other's work and then settled in to present his case. The hearing was before a probate judge, not a jury, which mattered. Probate judges are specialists. They hear contested wills regularly. They are largely immune to the emotional performances that sometimes move lay juries. Foss presented first. He outlined the capacity argument. Daniel had been on significant pain medication in his final weeks. The will had been signed under conditions of physical and emotional vulnerability, and the dramatic change in beneficiary from a will that had previously included Beverly as a partial heir indicated that something had interfered with Daniel's normal judgment. Then Tanner presented what Daniel had prepared. The oncologist's evaluation came first, a written assessment from Dr. Patricia Hendricks at Emory, dated 6 days before the signing, confirming that Daniel retained full cognitive function and decision-making capacity. Dr. Hendricks had anticipated being called on this and had written the evaluation in explicit, clinical language. Foss objected on grounds of foundation. The judge overruled him. Next came the witness statements. The 2 people who had witnessed Daniel's signing were present in person. Gerald Marsh, a retired engineer who had been Daniel's neighbor for 6 years, and Sandra Obie, a former colleague who had maintained a friendship with Daniel throughout his illness. Neither had any relationship with me prior to witnessing the will. Both gave clear, consistent accounts of Daniel's demeanor, lucid, deliberate, and without any indication of coercion. "Was Mrs. Cole present at any point during the signing?" Tanner asked Sandra Obie. "No," she said. Mr. Cole specifically asked that she not be present. He said he didn't want her to feel like he was, and I'm quoting him, "making the whole thing feel like a business transaction." I sat at the table and kept my face still, because what Sandra had just said was something only Daniel would have said, in exactly the language he would have used. Foss attempted to recover by pushing the undue influence angle. Specifically, he called Beverly herself to speak to the nature of my relationship with Daniel's family. Beverly, on the stand, was composed and precise. She spoke of her concern for Daniel. She spoke of changes she had observed in him after our marriage. She used the word isolated 3 times. She was a credible witness, and I will acknowledge that. She believed her own narrative, which made her more effective than someone simply lying. Then Tanner cross-examined her. He asked about the timeline of Beverly's first contact with her attorney, Gerald Foss. The answer was 6 weeks before Daniel's death, while Daniel was still alive, while Beverly had presumably not yet known what the will contained. Why had Beverly contacted an estate attorney before her son had died? Beverly said she'd been preparing for practical matters. Tanner asked whether Beverly had made any statements to Megan Cole about the estate prior to Daniel's death. Beverly said she didn't recall specific statements. Tanner produced the written documentation I had prepared after Beverly's kitchen conversation. November, the night she'd told me I was not a Cole by blood and the assets belonged to the Cole family. He entered it into evidence. Beverly said she didn't recall saying those things in those words. Tanner then produced the documentation of Beverly's January visit, the casserole visit, including her specific statement that she could make the process painful in ways that have nothing to do with the law, socially, professionally. Beverly's jaw tightened. That was taken out of context. What was the context? Tanner asked pleasantly. She didn't have a satisfying answer. Foss objected. The judge allowed limited continuation. Then came the moment that broke Beverly's composure entirely. Tanner asked one final question. Mrs. Cole, were you aware that your son had, in the weeks before his death, independently researched estate attorneys in the Roswell area, made an appointment without consulting any family member, and traveled to that appointment alone? Beverly said she had not been aware of that. Were you aware that he had specifically instructed the attorney to document the absence of any familial pressure or presence? Beverly looked at her attorney. Foss gave her nothing. No, she said. So your son made this decision privately, deliberately, with medical documentation of his capacity, in the presence of 2 independent witnesses, with instructions specifically designed to prevent any challenge. And you're telling this court that it was his wife who somehow orchestrated all of that. Beverly opened her mouth, closed it. Her hands on the railing of the witness stand were white at the knuckles. He was confused, she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. He wasn't. He hadn't been himself. The physician who evaluated him disagrees, Tanner said. The judge called a brief recess. During it, I sat at the table and drank the rest of my cold coffee and felt nothing I could name simply. Not triumph, something quieter. The satisfaction of a thing being seen clearly in the correct light. The judge did not take long. Following the recess, both sides offered closing arguments. Foss did his professional best. He was a skilled attorney, and he presented the case as coherently as the case could be presented. But the foundation Beverly had given him was built on suggestion and implication rather than evidence, and the material Tanner had assembled, the physician's evaluation, the independent witnesses, the contemporaneous documentation of Beverly's own statements, had made the opposing narrative very difficult to sustain. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Patricia Almonte. She'd been on the bench for 18 years. She listened to both closing arguments with the focused patience of someone who has heard this kind of dispute many times and has developed a precise instrument for separating what is true from what is simply asserted with conviction. When she spoke, she was direct. She found no evidence to support the allegation of undue influence. She noted that the will had been drafted and executed under conditions that, if anything, were specifically designed to prevent undue influence. Independent counsel, independent witnesses, medical documentation, and the deliberate absence of the beneficiary. She noted that the timing of Beverly Cole's contact with her own estate attorney, weeks before Daniel's death, while he was still alive, suggested that Beverly had anticipated a need to contest the will before she had any legal basis to do so, which spoke to her motivations rather than to any defect in Daniel's decision. The capacity argument fared no better. Dr. Hendrix's evaluation was accepted as credible. The witness's testimony was consistent and unimpeached. The judge found no medical or factual basis to question Daniel's judgment at the time of signing. The contest was denied. The will stood in its entirety. I heard this sitting at a table in a probate courtroom in Atlanta on a Thursday afternoon in February, with Tanner beside me and a half-empty cup of water in front of me. The judge moved on to the procedural next steps. Tanner wrote notes. I sat and let it happen. Beverly was across the room. I didn't look at her during the ruling. I looked at the judge, because the judge was the relevant person. When I finally glanced toward Beverly, only briefly, only once, she was staring at the table in front of her. Diane, beside her, had her arms crossed and her face turned away. Foss was speaking quietly into Beverly's ear, professional to the last. Outside the courthouse afterward, Tanner shook my hand with genuine warmth. "Daniel prepared well," he said. "He did," I agreed. There were still practical steps to complete. The probate process continued for another 4 months, as Georgia procedure required, settling creditors and finalizing the estate accounting. Beverly and Diane did not attempt any further formal legal action. The threat of social and professional retaliation that Beverly had made in my kitchen also failed to materialize in any meaningful form. I later understood why. When a court publicly finds against your credibility in the manner it had found against Beverly's, the social capital required for a sustained reputational campaign is substantially diminished. People in their circle of Marietta acquaintances knew what had happened. The story was not easy to spin. Beverly did not contact me again. Diane sent one text, 3 weeks after the ruling, a single sentence. "I hope you're happy." I read it, set the phone down, and went back to what I had been doing. What I had been doing was beginning the long, ordinary process of deciding what my life was going to be. That process was not dramatic. It was simply what came next. Spring came that year in the particular way it comes in North Atlanta. Suddenly, as though it had been waiting just outside the door. The oak tree in the backyard put out new leaves with a speed that felt almost deliberate. I made a decision in April. I was going to stay in the house. I know what people sometimes say about that it must be too full of memory, too heavy with grief, and I won't pretend those things aren't true. Daniel is in that house, in the way the kitchen light hits the counter in the late afternoon, in the squeak of the second stair, in the garden bed along the south fence that he dug the summer before he got sick. Living there is a continuous low-frequency presence of him, and I have made my peace with that. It is not a haunting. It is a home. By May, I had gone back to work full-time. I signed up for a landscape design class at a community college in the fall, something I'd been curious about for years. I went with Joanna to Portugal in October, which had been on a list Daniel and I kept on the refrigerator for years. I went because it had been on the list, and because crossing things off a list you made with someone you loved is one of the more complicated forms of continuity available to you. I stayed in touch with Marcus, and we had dinners with Daniel's old friends. Evenings where people remembered him honestly, with humor and specificity, the way you want the people you love to be remembered. By the following spring, I was different than I had been, not unrecognizable, not hardened, simply more certain of what I was, and less willing to apologize for it. As for Beverly and Diane, Beverly had spoken openly to her circle about her certainty she would prevail. The ruling contradicted this publicly and completely. Her social authority diminished. Two close friends withdrew over the following year. The contest had cost her significantly from her own retirement savings. Money she never recovered. Diane's marriage did not survive the year. She moved back to Marietta, into the house she grew up in, working through a reckoning she had long deferred by staying focused on other people's lives. I do not gloat. Their consequences were real and proportional, and that is all I need to say. But I would be dishonest if I said it gave me no satisfaction. It gave me the particular satisfaction of a thing that went as it should. I thought of Daniel often through all of this. He had known Beverly. He had known exactly what she was capable of, and he had spent the last reserves of his energy making sure she couldn't take from me what he had built for us. That act of love was not small. It was among the largest things anyone has ever done for me. I planted dahlias in the garden bed along the south fence that second April. They came up in July in every color available, extravagant and slightly excessive, exactly the way Daniel would have liked them. This story ends with triumph, but what it required along the way was clarity. In the middle of grief and threat, sometimes you have to act first and feel later. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay still, say little, and let what is true stand on its own. Beverly mistook my silence for weakness. She didn't understand that silence is sometimes the last thing you do before you begin. If someone has ever told you that you don't belong, that what you built isn't yours, know this: their certainty is not reality. They are betting you'll accept their version. You don't have to. What would you have done? Leave a comment, share this story, and thank you truly for listening.